All right, welcome back, everybody. This is Pete, Brian, and Jake here, otherwise known as PB&J.
PB&J, I did hear that.
Yeah.
So one of us.
Was it?
Oh, it was.
Which
I
one
know
of
who
you?
it was. I'll give a shout out to my good buddy Eric. Was the one that
Did he do that?
he did. Yeah, he listened to it and told his wife, I think I like some PB&J.
We go. So PB&J back again for another episode here, and this one's also another doozy here because I know there are going to be a bunch of people who disagree with what we're going to say about it. Actual sin, guys. So this is the one we're going to talk about what it means to turn away from God and what the end result is as we move forward. So before I go into the questions, I'm going to remind everyone again, thank you for listening, and also please subscribe to us. So any updates you can get from us, you're going to get it through the subscription. Follow us, you'll get stuff coming out. Look at SoundCloud, iTunes, Spotify. Make sure to comment if you have any questions. Hit us up, and we're happy to go and answer questions. And enjoy this next episode then. So here, going right into it. Is original sin the only kind of sin? Because we talked last week a lot about the original sin that is what Adam and Eve committed when they violated the one rule that God had given them. Well, guess what? We all know that's not the only sin. So there's a bunch of others out there. And so now we're going to get into actual sin. This is what we now have the opportunity to commit and unfortunately do on all too regular a basis. And then there's so much stuff in regarding sin. Like this is one of the things where I think Christianity overall, and I wouldn't say it gets a bad rap, but I think all of its detractors will start just piling on when it has to do with sin. And man, you guys just want to make all these just random rules, and this is where they'll go. Same with the Catholics. If you want to go after a group, they'll go after Catholics in the Catholic Church because there's just no comprehension at all the differences between what is biblical from the standpoint of what we're commanded by Christ to do versus the precepts of the church, that we have obligations that, look, if we are Catholic, it's more than just saying, hey, I'm Catholic on Sundays sometimes, and maybe Christmas Eve,
There's a lot of people that conflate the holy faith with the fallible natures of human beings, and it tends to get intertwined. And then, of course, all they point to is the human hypocrisy and the failures of leadership. And then on the other side, I've heard, I don't know how many times I've heard about the sexual repression of the Catholic Church. It's like, are you serious? Like, we're the ones with 197 kids per family and buses showing up. So clearly can't be repressed in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
I think it's the old Puritan American.
Yeah, well, the whole idea that we're talking about, people, they love to detract, right? Well, is this a sin? Is that a sin? I don't need a book to tell me what's a sin. And what about the Leviticus? You don't follow all those laws. Are you sinning with that? And I like to call it, I like to think of it as the Black Knight attack, right? They're just like this little horse on the chessboard just hopping around all over the place. And it's just like, nope. All right, let's stay on track here, buddy. Let's stay on track. It's one at a time. They just hop all over the place. But yes, clearly there is sin, right? I mean, this whole idea, I don't need a book to tell me if I'm a good person.
You're talking as people say that kind of thing. I don't need a book to tell me if I'm good.
Oh,
I got this.
yes.
I'm fine, man.
Yes, that was not me saying it, but
I don't need God. I'm good.
Heard, and he's a good friend of mine. I heard him say, he said that one time, I don't need a book to tell me, what's wrong or what's right. And I'm like, then what does? What does?
What is the standard?
Yes, exactly. What is the standard? And by the way, where did this generally, I would say there's an undercurrent. It's not exactly stamped on every human heart, what is right, what is wrong. But generally we can agree, don't murder, don't rape, don't steal, don't be mean to people.
Whatever that means, though.
Cruel, I should say, not mean, but don't be cruel. Like you shouldn't be, everybody, I would say 99.9% of humanity, if you showed them a video of a dude torturing a cat to death, would go, that's messed up. How do we know that? If
there are things that intrinsically we all know are wrong. You can watch babies do not like when stuff is stolen away from them. In the end, no one likes being hit. That's just the thing where we're all like, that kind of sucks, man. And don't get me wrong, there's weird stuff that goes on out in the world, but generally speaking, or whatever, if you're not expecting it, I don't want to get cold cocked in the side of the head. That's gonna be bad, and we're all in agreement there. The problem that we're going to have to acknowledge from the standpoint of morality and sin and why we would sit there and say, no, definitively that is wrong, is because to be a Christian means we have to accept a morality that supersedes ourselves. There has to be an objective morality that we all subscribe to, that we all can uniformly agree that is out of bounds, and this is acceptable. This was commanded, that was outright objected, refused, told us that if we did it, we would be punished for it. Because if everyone individually makes up their own morality, there is no morality.
Correct, and that's the whole idea of that's the whole idea of like, if I reject, right? This is the fallback, like make me feel good argument. If I reject that the church has authority to deem, what is moral, immoral, if I take that away, then somehow I take away the idea of sin, right? If I do away with universal morality that is being told, like, hey, here are the rules laid out, this, that, and the other. Well, if I get rid of that, or if I just deny it, or if I stick my head in the dirt, then the consequences go away too.
I can do what I want.
That's how people like to make themselves feel better. Well, it's again sexual oppression, right? That's another one in this. Sexual oppression. Like I'm not hurting anybody. Like whatever it is, and you can keep telling yourself that all you want. But as we talked in the previous episode, you start to have very bad physiological, psychological effects of immoral sexual behavior that will manifest themselves and make it very, very hard for you to interact in the world with other humans, make it very hard for you to go about your day-to-day life,
and I think
even
that,
when alone.
And we'll cover that, though, too. We're going to cover the effects of sin. What starts to happen is everything starts to fall apart. So going back to sanctifying grace and what we have when we're close to God, there is so much protection and so much fulfilling results from being with God that when you start to leave him, you're not whole, you're not right, there are problems, everything starts to break down.
You get that angst in the back of your head.
Yeah, you're never comfortable. You can't rest. You'll never trust anybody. The whole thing starts to come completely unraveled to the point where you cannot even understand which way is up. You would actually be able to argue it and actually think that you're making sense trying to twist everything around. And this is the most difficult time that Catholics have dealing, and I would say catechized Catholics, and I'm not trying to insult people who've never been educated. That's why we're here, okay, to try and help people get up to speed, to understand where to find all this stuff, to get it sorted out, so you can clearly see which way is up, what is right, what is wrong. But poorly catechized Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, Jews, or whatever, man, the argument starts not having any idea what actually makes logical sense. And they start making some of the weirdest arguments that actually have no basis in fact, especially when you start to pull additional facts in. And I think then not only are you losing your ability to rationalize the farther away you move from actual grace, but you're losing your ability to even see truth, to see facts and everything else.
Well, you end up with a moral vertigo. And that's really, I think for me, looking back on my journey into the church, some things I had to rectify. And I was like, wow, that I didn't realize that was sinful, or this, whatever. I could pick a litany of examples. But then the second you're oriented and you have your moral horizon again, you can start to navigate.
You become keenly aware of the pitfalls.
Very sensitive to it.
Yeah, and I think the best one for guys, at least, that I could totally point out like quickly is second glances and looking too long at women.
Yes.
It's the easiest one to just follow. You're like, and then I just did it again. Like it becomes not only, it's habitual. You have to actually then start thinking about how to get out of it. You don't actually feel bad about it when you don't know any better, to sit there and go, oh no, seriously, you've already sinned. Like you've already committed adultery in your mind. It's bad. It's terrible. As long as if you know what's going on. And when you're outside of the fold, when you're in that diabolic disorientation, that weird smoke of Satan thing going on, you're like, whatever, man, that vertigo, I'm good. Until you walk away from it and you look back and you go, oh, that is the most disgusting thing it's
like going back and like a football player watching film and having a coach there explaining what you're looking at. In the moment, whatever sport you're playing, basketball, football, wrestling, hockey, I don't know, baseball. In the moment, you may just be in the moment. You may not have, when you look back, at least when I played sports anyways, I didn't have a very good recollection of how events played out. But going back and watching tape, then you go, oh yeah. And then you have somebody there who is who is the objective moral reason, right? Because that's what we're talking about, sin, but your coach who is the objective technical expert who is saying that was good, that was bad. And so hopefully next time you're in that situation, you have some sort of reference to be like, oh, I did this last time, that was not good.
And this is where we're going to get to judgment And that is almost exactly what happens. Only the worst part about that is in that instance, by the time you get to your judgment,
no do-over.
you're done. And then now Christ will go over and replay, basically on film, in the most vivid and realistic, and basically reliving it in your head and for everyone else to see, is when you get to go over everything you failed on, everything you refused to do for God, and then realize all the holes that were made. And I think that is the most profound difference about living the virtuous, devout, truly Catholic life versus everything that isn't, is that all of a sudden you can see how terrible God sees all of those other actions. And you don't look down on people for that. It's not because each one of us anyone in a state of grace can fall right back into it. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But the issue that's hardest to deal with is how disgusted, how angry, and how sad God is when he sees all of this.
Well, you're going up into, eventually, shortly we'll get to the two types of sin, but one, you have to acknowledge that you're capable of sinning. So understanding that you do have the free will and the choice. But then when you look at mortal sin, it's only the most offensive thing in the universe to God.
Well, actually, all sins are infinitely offensive. The real question is the difference of the damage one does to themselves.
So, yeah, you have this completely horrible sin.
That's why I call him Pete the Hammer.
Yeah, he's just hammering it all back in. But it's from God's perspective, what does that look like? You can see the damage, the natural damage that sin has on a person through natural consequences and effects. That's pretty obvious to us with some of the bigger stuff as far as, drug abuse again. If you end up with hepatitis or AIDS or whatever, that's a pretty obvious natural consequence. But then what does that self-inflicted damage do to God?
Well, so the whole thing, again, if you imagine a path, right? And on either side of the path are essentially whatever mob of angry, whatever you consider demons to look like, angry people, beings, things, right, that are trying to pull at you. The idea, and this is something that I struggled with for a long time after I came back, to the faith. And it started to make more and more sense as I conceptualized it this way. There is this belief, and we're not even into the sacraments and stuff, and so I won't really go down too far down the rabbit hole on like confession, but there's this belief, I can do this one sin, and then I got confession in a couple of days, and God will forgive me.
Oh, the
right?
presumption.
The presumption, right? That God will forgive me, or that I have enough time, or whatever it is.
Which is a sin.
Which is, yes, in itself is a sin, right? But what I'm saying is, it's not just, and we talked about this in the last episode, going however long down the wrong path, and how much you have to then fight to get back. But it's the same way. Like, you don't just step off the path and then you're among, these demons who are just like, all right, we got them off the path. Game's over. At that point, they're now pushing you as far away from the right path as possible, so that before you know it, you're despairing, you can't see the path anymore. And that's how they do it. They don't just let you step off the path and then you stop getting temptations. Once they've broken you, that's when the full assault comes, right? That's when they're sending in their version of the Calvary to try and rout you at that point. And so, yes, we can say mortal sin, people who are living in ignorance, almost to some degree, they're ignorant. They don't really know what's going on, right? But for those who realize what is right and what is wrong, the battle that you face when you give in to what is wrong is way, way worse than it was before, when you didn't know, when you're just kind of floating around. Because, yeah.
And I think, and for everyone listening, we're here right now to help you stay off that path, like the bad path, the wide path that leads to destruction. We're trying to help you get back. But there's very little way to navigate this landscape without a map. And what we're going to work on with the rest of the questions in this lesson here on sin are really know all the specifics about sin and what it is to walk away from God. Because only in knowing how bad it can go will you actually have any idea how to get back. And so we're going to end up with another controversial one here, especially with Protestants, is how many types of actual sin are there? Two. There's two types of actual sin. Those types are mortal and venial. And although there may be Protestants out there, they're the ones who I've argued most with on this topic, where they say no, not every sin is bad and whatever. And to that, I would agree. Every sin is infinitely bad against an infinite God, because any deviation from his perfect path is infinitely offensive to an infinite God who gave tons of, his own blood and his own suffering to help us, and yet we're going to go and just flip it right back in his face and be like, no, I don't want it. So that's bad. However, the real question is, and this is why we got to focus on that whole mortal thing, what does it mean to the condition of our souls? Certain sins, because we were just stupid, because we weren't in control, we did some other mistakes that got us into that situation, they weren't willful. We didn't understand that they were grave. And what was it? Full consent, knowledge, and
grave matter, full consent, and knowledge, and you acted upon it anyway. Your will applied it.
Yeah, but again, like you said, the grave matter, right? So it goes back to last week's French fry versus assault, right? Yeah. If I take your French fry, maybe it's just a French fry amongst friends, but I'm just, whatever it is, take it while you're not looking. I'm trying to deceive you. It's not good. But is it as bad as assaulting someone?
So we have degrees here that we need to discuss.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so again, we have to remember 3 conditions are for a mortal sin.
Has to be grave matter. You have to know it's grave matter, and you have to do it anyway.
There you go. So those are the 3 conditions. If you do not fully meet those 3 conditions, it is not mortal. Mortal meaning you have killed the sanctifying grace, your connection to God. Your soul, in effect, is dead. There is no connection to God, and as such, if you happen to die in that condition, that's it. Sorry, you're out, and you're not going to be able to go to heaven. This goes back to that whole justice problem. This goes back to God's mercy, and this goes back to all the commandments, is that if he says it is, we have to believe him. And this is where we have to go back to Scripture, because John actually says, at least John does, but there are sins that actually kill. And he actually talks about that verse. I don't know if anyone knows off the top of their head which verse that is, but that he literally states it. And that is the difference in terms of the state of our soul by the time we're done committing that sin. And then when we have to sit there and talk about mortal sin, this is where we go into the grievous nature of all of it. So, yeah, I can steal $5 from someone, and it doesn't really hurt them. I can steal by lying about them 100,000 from them, and now I may have ruined their livelihood, the livelihood of their family, and a whole bunch of other stuff, as well as got ill-gotten gains from my end, and actually created a whole bunch of situations. And this goes back to, okay, well, if no one knows about the fact that you stole it, did you really hurt all these other people because you found a way, like bank error in your favor, and you kept $1 million? Like, okay, maybe you don't think you hurt someone, but you totally offended God. That $1 million was supposed to go somewhere else. There are all these different impacts and secondary and tertiary effects. That's what actually raises the gravity of one of these sins. I don't know if you guys have anything else you want to add on that topic there.
I think for the beginners, you have to keep in mind, I think we're just trying to, I guess, give you the example of, murder is terrible. That's a grave sin. And I don't think there's too many people on planet Earth that would argue that wouldn't be a mortal sin under the parameters we're giving you. But then you look at the roots of it, down to anger. If I give you the old one finger salute out the car window because you cut me off, that would be a sinful act. It's an act against my neighbor. It's charity and self-control and a whole litany of other things. But you couldn't hardly call it grave. So that would qualify as the venial, the lesser of the sins. But enough lesser sin, enough venial sin added up over time, especially unchecked. As Jake was saying, you're kind of teetering on a path, and you're kind of choosing to walk the edges. And it doesn't take much to kind of push into a mortal at that point. So that's why we harp on the little things in order to keep ourselves centered on the narrow path, because it is quite narrow.
I think the idea, too, is that, some things due to our own fallen nature, our ignorance, sometimes we can sin in ways that they're venial only because we didn't stop to think about it, right? It's a habit, right? I take the Lord's name in vain, like in sheer pain or something like that, without thinking. Technically, that's venial. But if I take that split second to choose what word I want to use to express my pain and my dissatisfaction with the situation,
curse God,
and you just hold it in you for 2 seconds and just yell it out, well, now it's mortal. It's the same thing, again with your one-fingered salute thing there, right? If you're looking at somebody and just in full malice of them without disregard of who they are as a person and you're sitting there thinking like, oh, I hope something bad, whatever it is, and you're doing that. Well, now, I mean, that's way different than somebody honks at you and, just hey, like, get out of here. Like, you know what I mean? Like
all sin's against the fifth commandment, but there's gradation there.
Yes, there absolutely is. And the point is like, it comes down to, because God knows everything, right? So he knows our intent behind it, right? It goes into his forgiving nature, right? That he's just, but he also knows that we're fallible humans and we're going to make mistakes. And so maybe a minor mistake does not lose us with sanctifying grace, right? There's a debt we have to pay for offending him, but it doesn't mean that we've lost out on the beatific vision. But then there are other sins in which if we do not ask forgiveness, he will not forgive.
And I did find those verses, by the way. So 1 John 5:16 and 17 is where John actually is the one who tells us that there are sins that lead to death, and there are sins that are not leading to death in terms of they don't kill the soul outright. But in the end, we have to acknowledge there are sins that cut us off. And we should be really scared of being in that state of mortal sin. That's where John 9:31 actually sits there and says, God doesn't hear the prayers of sinners. And when he says that, he's meaning unrepentant sinners. And so if we're so oblivious to him that we're not even paying attention as to whether what we just did was completely offensive to God or not, we didn't try to go and validate and say, can someone prove to me that this was okay, that he wanted me to do this? He doesn't have to listen to our prayers. And there's Old Testament stuff that says the same effect. So we can't do this whole, like Brian was saying in the last episode, there's no new God and old God. There's no New Testament and Old Testament God.
We already talked about this. He's unchanging.
Yes, and as a result then, if he says, no, I don't hear the unrepentant, that should scare all of us. Because if we are ignorant enough or prideful enough to continue in sin, he can leave us. And then if and when we die, talk about a rude awakening.
I mean, did he really leave us, or did we leave him a long time ago?
Correct. And that's the Sistine Chapel, Adam and God. If you look at their arms, go look at that painting. It's really interesting.
Just stretched out as far as he could.
If you look at God, God's arm is fully stretched, no bend, no nothing. Everything he's got is out there. And then look at Adam, who's got a bend in his arm going, and
not today. Not today.
So yes, we leave God, and in the end, then he respects that. Again, going back to our free will discussion we had, he respects our free will. So
and it's not like hanging in the balance either. When you go up there for the particular judgment, once you get the realization, up there, and you're just like, oh my goodness, I was so wrong. I did, you're gonna have to sit through that judgment, but it's not gonna be a surprise ending.
Yeah, and if you listen, there's a talk out there by Father Casey on spiritual combat. He talks about that, and it was one of those images that sticks in your head. Is that you remember when we're trying to look at sin, we're really looking at it from God's perspective. That's the whole thing about being Christian. We have to flip everything around. It's not about what I think or what I want.
You have to come outside of yourself. That's what we've been talking about.
Yeah, you have to look at God's perspective. And the whole problem then we should really be contemplating in our end, especially when we get to that particular judgment moment of truth in terms of how we did. Father Casey talks about the fact that this judge is one with whom you cannot negotiate. He knew everything that led up to every decision you made. He knew the justification you had in your head as to why you thought it was okay. He knew everyone else's intentions involved in it. And he saw every single way you could have avoided it. And still, you went right in. And now the only possible excuse you have is my imperfections, my vices, my choice. It's terrible. Totally crushing in terms of this is what God has in store for those who actually sin. And remember, the path is wide that leads to destruction. The majority of people are going to go through that negative and terrible experience when God tells them, be gone from me, you workers of evil. That should be chilling. And all of our life should be lived because we don't want to end up in that state of mortal sin. And that's question 67 hits it from the standpoint of it's deadly because it deprives us of sanctifying grace, no supernatural life. In the end, that means no heaven. That's terrible. We need to treat this very sincerely. Maybe seriously. I don't know. There's probably a better word. I'm trying to think of but it's serious. There's nothing more serious.
Grave matter.
It is a grave matter. Look at that. Almost like it's written to state that point.
Yeah. Not only do you not get heaven, but you also get the other one.
It's only one of two states we're going to end up in the end. And if you choose heaven, you choose the the first step in the spiritual life is just ridding yourself of the garbage of mortal sin. And there's a lot of junk in the closet to clean out after a lifetime of just stupidity, nominal cultural living. The second step, I think, is even more tedious, which is ridding yourself of all the venial sin and all the...
So tough.
What's the word I'm looking for? Just the vices, the little...
Well, it's justified. Yeah, it's justified mistakes in our heads. So this is the thing. So like, make sure, listeners, just so you know, when I'm sitting there talking about stupidity, and you could get angry at me, don't know if...
We are self-accusing.
Yeah. Right now, I'm looking at this from the standpoint of like, I came into this Catholic faith from being a Protestant who had totally justified every single behavior that I had ever chosen to do. And then I get to this point where all of a sudden I'm having to evaluate and now go through full examinations of conscience and look at what morality God spoke of in the Beatitudes, which everyone says so beautiful, except for they're so hard. They're really impossible. And I look at every place I fell short. I was not meek. I was not disciplined. I did not take care of the needy. I took care of myself. I didn't go to worship every Sunday, even though God, basically, I owe him everything. I didn't give him everything. I didn't give him the best, let alone give friends. I'll put that in quotes, is that I didn't treat them as friends. I didn't give them the best that I had. Like, I look at everything I totally did wrong and made mistakes on and thought, it's all good, man, until I get there. And that whole realization, like, oh, man, I was terrible. I was absolutely terrible. And in the end, when you look at it from God's perspective and he's looking at this feeble-minded, Pete down there, man, what an idiot. I feel bad for him if he would just come back and not be so stupid. And now my whole struggle then on a daily basis is not being dumb. It's trying to make sure that I actually have the desire to be with him all the time, to give him everything that I have, knowing that he is the end of all things. He's the beginning of all things. And the only reason anything around me exists is because of him. It's just logical. Like,
so getting back, like the idea of what are the effects of sin, right, on us? We already talked about grave, not getting to heaven.
Question 68.
Right? Like we already talked about not getting to heaven.
Mm-hmm.
There seems to be this prevailing thought, and I have so many specific examples from my recent past interactions with friends or acquaintances. There seems to be a belief that you can separate the sin from the sinner, right? So that's where you get this whole idea, the essentially a Protestant idea, right? That like, yeah, I know I'm doing something I shouldn't be, but God knows that I'm a good person.
Well, let's caveat this, because the thing is as you say that, you literally do separate the sin from the sinner in one capacity. So we're talking about, in a certain way, the sinner is fully culpable for his sins, and we have to acknowledge that. But we have to make sure that when we look at the atheist, the Satanist, the Protestant, the Muslim, whatever, we as Catholics are taught to love those individuals for who they are, or who they can be, really, I should say, and what God has bestowed in them. Because if they can get their sanctifying grace, if they can come back to the one true faith, if they can come back to Christ and submit everything before his prelates and whatever, then in the end we can love that person. That person can be good.
That's not what I'm arguing,
and we can
though.
separate it. We just have to make sure. I'm just giving it as a caveat to make sure that
So maybe
anyone
we can rephrase
listening.
it then. So but there's the idea, right? And it goes back to what we've already talked about, the whole, I'm a good person, but nothing good in this world can come that isn't of God's will, right? No act can be classified as good if it is not what God actively wills. But there is a idea that I know I shouldn't be doing this. However, God knows that I'm a good person. Right? And what does Aristotle say, right? That excellence is not an act, but a habit, right? And was it Thomas Aquinas that also talked about that virtue is not essentially says the same thing. It's not an act, but it's a lifestyle, or it's a acquired form of behavior. So, but that right there, if you can break people of that thought process of, yeah, I know I shouldn't be doing this, but God, this goes back to Jesus is my drinking buddy. He's the guy that I'm barbecuing with. Like he knows me. We are bringing him down to our imperfect level with those understandings. But if you can break people of the idea of, or make people realize, I should say, that no, until you repent, until you stop doing these things, you can never be good as God intended you to. Because of what you're continuing to do, this idea that like you can separate your lifestyle, your acts, the works that you cultivate on this earth, that somehow you can separate your soul from that into being like, yes, but I'm actually a good person, and God knows that.
That's what Pete talked about, the rationalization of our behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're in that tempest, you're not really tethered to anything. You're not oriented in a particular direction. It's going towards the good. I'm telling you, people, you can rationalize anything if you want.
This is how murder is justified. This is how
The
genocide is
Nazis
justified.
were able to justify a lot. Communists were able to justify
Anyone
a
can
lot.
justify evil. It doesn't take anything. And to be perfectly honest, this goes back to Adam and Eve. They justified a grave evil that ultimately resulted in pains for all of us. And in the end, it's about keeping our focus on God's perspective so that we can make good decisions to avoid the ramifications of mortal sin.
We justify abortion all the time, to essentially bring it down to the level of like, well, are we going to have weekday parking on Main Street or not? Like, like it's some sort of issue to be argued over.
And I think this is where, let's go into question 68, because I started to talk about it, but right here is a good moment to sit there and say, besides depriving the sinner of sanctifying grace, what else does mortal sin do to the soul? And then, besides depriving the sinner of sanctifying grace, mortal sin makes the soul an enemy of God, takes away the merit of all its good actions, deprives it of the right to everlasting happiness in heaven, and makes it deserving of everlasting punishment in hell. Now, all of those things, when we look at that result, in the middle there, that diabolic disorientation also deprives us of the use of reason. No longer can we properly evaluate what is important and what is not, what is of God and what is not. Everything starts to come apart, especially if we won't align our will to God. So everything's within our power. This goes back to the free will thing.
We lose free will. We lose reason, right? We retreat into ourselves, as we've talked about before, and then our will becomes hardened against God, and we become our own worst enemy. When we find ourselves in that self-created hell on earth that is an addiction or unrepentance or whatever it is, we're so within ourselves and not acting out in goodwill towards God, bringing God the glory he deserves, and acting in goodwill to our neighbors. We're so trapped in our own terrible attempts of rationalization that we are literally using our own free will against ourselves.
Spiritual suicide. And not only spiritual suicide, but infinite offense against God. And sitting there saying you're leaving him with no other option other than damnation. And that's why hell, in the grand scheme, when we decide that our will is more important than his, our flawed will, impacted by original sin, impacted by the corruption of the world, impacted at times by demons as well, and we're like, no, mine actually makes the most sense, then why does he care what we want anymore? Like, from the standpoint of comfort, and from the standpoint of sanctity, from what he's going to look at, he's like, no, you don't want any of that. You want disorder. If we crave the disorder of the world, and we crave sin, and we crave the advice of demons, we crave the corruption of the will, the diabolic disorientation and confusion, he's going to be like, I'll give it to you. And you can have it forever even. I'm not even going to give it temporarily. You can have it in hell and go for it. That's what you asked for.
But there's the disorientation that you get up front with it, though. Once you're in a state of mortal sin, the enemy is not going to want to knock you off the wide path. The comfort will be there.
You're coasting at that point.
You're coasting. The easiness of it. You're not going to find much friction in your relations or workplace. It is quite a strategy.
Now, granted, the problem is that venom can actually strike at any time. The problem is that in hell there are no friends. Therefore, demons hate each other as well as the humans that they are destroying. So in the end, there's always going to be pain. The question is, what's the point of it?
So, I mean, it's to, again, go back to 1 degree, right, in a 360. And if you got them just off 1 degree, but you don't know you're off 1 degree, well, then, yes, I would say that the demon, Satan, whatever diabolic forces are happy and content to let you coast 1 foot off the path if you don't know. But if you know, if you are aware of what is right, what is wrong, and you go off, well, then they're going to try and get you as far away from that path as possible, that you despair, that you essentially... you lose your reason, you become disoriented, and it just becomes almost impossible for you to use your free will to get out of it, to essentially despair and go, well, I know what I should do, but now it's exponentially so much harder for me to get back on that path, whether that's going to be loss of human relationships in this world, whether that's going to be physical pain, whether that's going to be monetary pain, whether that's going to be public humiliation, whatever it is, you lose all that. And also too, by the way, when you're talking about God giving us use of our free will into eternity, if we reject him, if we want to go hang out with demons, that's important too. There seems to be another weird understanding, whether it's poorly catechized Catholics or Protestants, that there's like, at the end you die and you go to your judgment and you get the last attempt to make your case. Like, oh, hey, now that I'm here, God, I do love you and only you. Like, that ship sailed.
Well, and you have to ask too whether or not that a soul that didn't want to actually follow God in this life.
That's the point, is you wouldn't.
Didn't like God just because it's like, nah, that's not me. I don't feel like that. I'm gonna kind of go my own way. Well, at that point, wouldn't heaven be the most painful and grueling experience, say for Satan now? Like, why would you want to be there?
Well, that's the whole point, is when you die, your soul is locked for eternity in the way in which you let it pass into that world. So you don't want to go to heaven. You willingly throw yourself into hell. And it's important for people to realize that, like, you don't get this, this idea of like, all right, I'm dead. Now it's my time to make peace with God. Like that, again, that's over.
Yeah.
Came and gone.
And I think we'll get to that when we talk death, judgment, hell and heaven. Because we'll try and get a little bit back on track now. I think the rationalization, though, and the knowledge is really key to the next question in terms of what makes sin mortal. And Brian already covered this, and we're going to try to keep hammering it home. But the thought, desire, word, or action, or omission, so this means not doing stuff when you were supposed to do stuff, also is equally sinful. If it's grave and it's serious, that's condition 1. So you did something that was a grave matter. 2, the sinner must know that it was wrong. And 3, the sinner fully consented. So if you didn't know it was wrong, but you did a grave thing, there are people out there, women who are atheists or whatever else, and they have an abortion, and they feel emotional pain or whatever else. There's all sorts of problems or whatever. Technically, although it's grave, and although they fully consented to it in certain cases, for them it's not a mortal sin because they actually weren't aware that it was actually a mortal sin. And we can go through a whole bunch of other...
They may not know.
I
would caveat that, because there may also be a time where you were raised in a Catholic school and you were told abortion is not good, and you know that, you've heard that, and you willfully walked away. So I would just say, I would be careful, because you may have plausible deniability of being like, man, I've literally never heard any of this. All right, cool, you didn't know. Then it's not mortal sin. But if you really had an examination of conscience, how many times...
Yeah, I can speak. Let me just say from experience here. So being Protestant and not being Catholic, and living the first 30-some years of my life as a Protestant, and then going through my initial examination of conscience and my initial confession, going through and trying to evaluate these criteria, and knowing that technically everything I'm confessing, this is one of the things where it's like, it's a free pass from the standpoint of, look, all you got to do is confess. Just get rid of it, because all of the things I did that I know of that were grave, they were in that list. Even some of the venials were in that list. And I know that at the time I fully consented to it. It doesn't mean that I'm not disgusted by them now. It doesn't mean that I don't find them absolutely terrible. It doesn't mean that I don't have flashbacks, memories, whatever, and like, oh man, I remember when I was doing that and how I thought it was great. And it's still how God was not happy with me in that moment. It's still going to hurt. The main takeaway here, though, is all 3 of these conditions must be present, or else it cannot be a mortal sin. And what we're trying to fight against here, which I know a couple of us have issues with, is scrupulosity, and just sit there and go, ooh, was it mortal? And you just sit there and rack your brain for like hours or more, or days, and you're just like, I don't know.
Yeah, that was my point, is don't be scrupulous and say like, well, I didn't really know, like I didn't have the catechism right in front of me. I would always err on the side of...
Well, you're in both sides. The problem is there's scrupulosity like Luther had, where he would sit in confession for 12 hours and think that everything he confessed was not forgiven. That's bad one way. The other one is scrupulous to the point where you're like, nah, I don't need to confess it. It's fine. And
you rationalize it. Oh, that was just a venial. But...
So it's just trying to go through and just say, hey, maybe I don't know whether they're venial or mortal. I just got to go through them and figure them all out. But again, you have to have all 3 conditions. Therefore, if like, say, I don't know, you're drunk, or you were forced into doing something that's terrible, so you don't have full consent, then again, it's back into, well, it's not a mortal sin. It's grave, and yeah, you knew it was wrong, which is why you tried to stop, but something happened and you followed through with it. All those things must be considered in order to determine whether or not it's a mortal or a venial sin. And so that leads us into the next question, 70 here. What is a venial sin? And a venial sin is a less serious offense against the laws of God. So in the end, still, God's infinite. If you offend God, it's going to be an infinite offense. Now, the gravity really is going to talk about whether or not you could undo the effects of this sin. So like venial sins, yeah, you can do restitution. It's pretty straightforward. But like murder, there's no going back from that. It's over. Like you can't bring back to life the person that was murdered. Manslaughter, things like that. Those are grave matters versus like, oh, well, I broke this thing and then I lied about it and didn't tell anyone I broke. Well, if it was a stupid $5 plate and no one even counted plates, then okay, whatever. You know, you can buy a new plate. So that's really what we're talking about. Is they're less serious in terms of their gravity. You're not deprived of sanctifying grace because in the end, you didn't follow through on everything that made it a mortal sin. And then that means that you can be pardoned even without a sacramental confession. So therefore, holy water can help if you're getting doused by holy water from a priest. If you take the Eucharist, things like that, there are ways those venial sins can go away. As long as you're contrite, you want them confessed. The problem is you can compound it if you're going to say, well, I don't think I was wrong. Well, that's bad. But otherwise, yeah, what we're really talking about here is there's the 3 conditions for mortal, and then for venial, those 3 conditions are not satisfied, so it's kind of everything else.
And just to emphasize that we need to be cautious with the venial sins. Pete did mention that we should be confessing them. But at the same time, if you, I guess we'll get to near occasion of sin here shortly, but if you constantly put yourself in the mindset that, well, it's not mortal, so I'll just keep doing it, then you're going to slip. It's going to happen. And you need to be just as vigilant when it comes to the small things as you would be the big things.
It's important, too, to find a priest if you are confused at all, to have good counsel, someone who's objective, someone who's not going to sit there like you will for your own self and rationalize, well, I don't really think that was mortal, venial. Like, get out of yourself. Go find somebody who gives you good counsel, i.e. your priest.
A good hint on those, and this is kind of from experience, and don't get me wrong, you'll find ones that are outside this mold, and if you can, that's awesome. But if they wear a cassock, you're going to have a higher likelihood that you're going to get someone who's going to be very straightforward with you and blunt.
Explain what a cassock is for those who don't know.
So a cassock is the black priestly garment that is, for lack of a better term, that in the 21st century, people would try to say dress and mock it. But in the end, it actually looks like a suit coat top from the waist up. And then there's a sash around it. It's buttoned all the way down. And then on the bottom, as opposed to pant legs, it actually is opened up more. Not, I don't know if gown's the right word.
I'm not sure how to describe it.
For those of you who like the BBC show, there's a good show, Father Brown. Google Father Brown if you're listening to this. He wears a cassock.
Yep. And I want to say that Fulton Sheen was always in a cassock. You have a handful.
Yes.
So you have a whole bunch of individuals that are always wearing cassocks, but
it's not the black business suit with the high collar.
No, I think Pete's warning against Father Feelgood or Bishop Feelgood. That's
if you know their first name, maybe
that could be an indicator that there may be some issues there. But either way, what we're really getting at here is just make sure that you are doing the reading in the catechism. This is why we're doing these lessons. You keep doing reading in the church fathers and the doctors to stay in line with church teachings 100%, so that you know that when you go talk to a priest and you can say, hey, Father, this is a sin. Can you please forgive me? Then he's going to agree with you, as opposed to doing the, nah, don't worry about it, you're fine. If that happens, run and don't ever go back, because he's committing a sin by not allowing you to actually follow through on the stuff that you need to do. And he's ultimately encouraging you to actually commit sins as well. So just make sure that, just think about it as we're going through there. And we're going to go into the next question from here. How can a sin be venial? Well, it's 2 ways. The evil done is not seriously wrong. This goes back again. It's just a minor matter. And the evil is done in a way that the sinner sincerely believes that it really wasn't that bad, or doesn't give full consent to it. So this goes back to, again, if you don't have all 3 conditions, it cannot be mortal. Therefore, these people are rationalizing away why, it's not that bad. It's just whatever. Well, if that's what's going on through some people's heads, that's what turns into venial sins. But like Brian's saying, you can stack those up. No. They can get really bad. They can get out of control. People can lose their way. They can fall off the path. They can end up in a state of mortal sin if they continue to do it without any consideration for the impact on their soul or the opinions of God. This is why St. Alphonsus actually has a great homily, if anyone wants to listen to it and feel a little bit closer to this topic, the number of sins beyond which a person cannot be pardoned. So at some point, they keep committing it, and God at some point says, stop mocking me, I'm done. And we're over.
So to clarify that, I always looked at it like the boiled frog. You get in the water's fine, it's all good. Then eventually the heat's raised up, and you get to a point where you become susceptible to greater and more graver sins because all of a sudden it doesn't seem so bad, especially considering the constant history of lesser sins. But St. Alphonsus isn't saying that God does not pardon. There's just a limit to how much he'll tolerate based on you have no idea when you're going to die. We have no idea. There's not one person that truly knows. And if you are presumptive enough to think that, oh, I'll just have this one weekend, I'll do all this stuff, and don't worry, I'll go confess on Monday, you're not guaranteed Monday. And at that point, God is not going to be mocked anymore with your behavior and your presumption.
Everything doesn't stay in Vegas?
No, it clearly doesn't. This generation will find out terribly.
He promises pardon to the penitent, but does not promise tomorrow to the unrepentant.
Yeah. And so then let's move into the last 4 questions we got here. How does venial sin harm us? Venial sin harms us by making us less fervent in the service to God, weakening our power to resist mortal sin, and making us deserving of God's punishments in this life or in purgatory. And that's presuming we don't tip over the edge into mortal sin. So this goes back to what were the pains that Adam and Eve suffered. In the end, they were going to get death. In the end, they had to then suffer all sorts of discomforts and pains and everything else. In the end, this is why Christ and Matthew and John and Paul and Peter and James, all of them agree this life is painful. So we have committed countless sins, all of us, and we are trying to get out of it. But in the end, the results of all of those sins, the amount of pain that we inflict upon ourselves is unfathomable in terms of what we have done, let alone being in the presence of those individuals, family members, friends, or just acquaintances, or people we don't even know. They just happen to walk by and do something terrible to somebody else, and you happen to be watching it, or you were affected by it directly. Those pains all come from all manner of sin. You just have this cascading chain reaction of sins just that's swirling all over the place. And that's where we come in to figure out what do we got to do to get out of that. Like, if these punishments are going to come one way or another, this is David getting punished just because he sinned with Bathsheba. In the end, first child dies. It doesn't matter that you said, hey, can you please forgive me? I'm sorry. He said, yeah, I'll forgive you. And yeah, I know you're sorry, but here comes the rest of what justice mandates.
And it is just, too, giving us the 3 conditions to know what is mortal, what will lead to us losing sanctified. It's not a guessing game. God's not up there just going, hope you guess right. Because behind door number 2, my friend,
You mean he's a loving and just father who says,
Exactly.
these are your rules. If you follow them, we're good. If you do not follow them, I have to punish you.
Yes.
How much malice does the parent have that doesn't discipline their children?
Yeah, and I think then this, as everyone hopefully is getting a little bit uncomfortable now, because we've talked through topics about being sinful, let's ask now, question 73, how can we keep from committing sin? Because all of us are dying to know right now, to sit there and stay away from hellfire and all the other punishments, or at least staying out of the bad mindsets as we suffer those ill effects. We can keep from committing sin by praying, by receiving the sacraments, remembering that God is always with us, recalling that our bodies are temples of the Holy Ghost, by keeping occupied with work or play, by promptly resisting the sources of sin within us and avoiding near occasions of sin. This is where I'm going to recommend, hands down, one of the best books I have ever read that actually covers a lot of this stuff, is The Spiritual Combat by Dom Scupoli. By the end of that first chapter, where he kind of lays the groundwork for what it is to live a devout life and live out of sin, he lays down 4 simple rules, which are right in line with what the Catechism just says right there. And his guidelines are very simple. In order, first, distrust oneself, going back to original sin and all the issues that we have every day. Confidence in God. So again, this is humility and knowing that his perfection is there when we need it. Proper use of the faculties of the body and mind. So this means keeping ourselves focused, keeping ourselves busy, at the times we need to be busy and focused on the right things, not just wasting time and twiddling thumbs and getting into trouble. And then lastly is the duty of prayer. So we have an obligation to continue strengthening our relationship with God. And if we follow those simple rules, in the end, everything else works. But yeah, check out the Spiritual Combat as a good way to kind of keep up to speed on the faults that we have in ourselves. And kind of when we start to go off the path, it's a good way to get back on. That was also a book recommended by Francis de Sales in his Intro to the Devout Life. He references and uses that book as an example of a spiritual work that we all should continue reading on a regular basis.
I would also say a commitment to penance, right? Or mortification, whether that's fasting, whether that's wearing a hair shirt. I don't, whatever your flavor of penance is.
Some sort of self-denial.
Some sort of self-denial, right? Because, there is a saying that I've heard many times in my life, which is pain retains, right? If it doesn't hurt, then you're very unlikely to remember it, right? This goes back to corporal punishment, right? A child does something that he very much should not have done, right? He stole and then purposely broke his sister's favorite doll, whatever it is. Those spankings will help him remember that is a totally unacceptable behavior, right? So if you are doing that for yourself or to yourself, self-denial in whatever form that takes place, along with prayer, it will help you be very cognizant while you're in that state of grace, after confession, after receiving sacraments. It will help you see those pitfalls. And we've kind of talked about it offline before, but it will make you extremely, the tolerance you have for those around you behaving in such a way will drop a lot. You won't have a lot of tolerance for it, and it'll essentially make you
force for good.
Yes. Zealous, I should say, would be the zealous for doing what's right.
Again, living well in a way that gets you free from those snares of the devil. All the devil's doing is we're talking about all the pains and all the corruptions and everything that happens as we go away from beauty and away from God. Tons of snares, and what we're trying to do is steer clear of those things.
The fun part is once you start to turn towards God, your confessions get more frequent. You feel more harassed, and you start to notice just the sheer volume of garbage that you are exposed to on a daily basis, whether it's at work or on TV or just your general life. And then as a convert, you also have the additional privilege of laying there in the middle of the night and having something you did 17 years ago pop forward in your brain, and you get to put that in your confession the next weekend as well. Yeah,
that's always fun, by the way, getting driving away from confession and then remembering what you forgot.
Yeah, I don't like that. I think the other thing too is prayer can't, atheists would like to mock it and say, oh, you say these words and magically everything. And it's no, but you're taking, right, we're in the physical world, and when you're praying, right, you're invoking God, his angels, the chosen saints, right? You're invoking their help, their protection. It's not easy, right? People say, oh, you say those magic words. Well, if it's that easy as you're claiming, then why don't you do it? Like, why don't you say the rosary every day, right? Oh, it only took 15 minutes. I'm supposed to say, but yet how many people actually do that? It's not easy, right? And so God looks at that, and it is essentially, right, when we're talking about confessing our sins, getting rid of the mortal and the venial sins, this is further along the path of essentially continuing to show God that, yes, I was contrite. That wasn't just like some random guilt trip that I felt and I had to go to confession. And, now that I'm out, I'm like, whoo, and, right back to it. Like it's showing, yes, like I'm trying to earn the forgiveness that I did not deserve. So prayer is a big one.
Yeah. And this is where let's expand here as we roll out on finishing this lesson here. What are the chief sources of actual sin? It's the 7 deadly sins. So this is pride, greed, lust, anger, gluttony, envy, and sloth. And so when we talk about pride, everyone's kind of familiar with pride, lording over, again, wanting to be the boss all the time, not thinking that you deserve being downtrodden or walked upon, that you think everyone should listen to you or whatever else. Greed, we're all familiar with greed, comes up all the time. Would you say something?
I was just going to say on the pride thing, it seems to be a very, very central ideology amongst Western secularism, right? Pride's manifested very much in the idea of rights is preeminent over responsibility, right? I have the right to do X, Y, Z. I have the right to, be, whatever it is I want to do, or to do whatever I want to do, as long as I'm not hurting anybody else. And we put such a focus and preeminence on that, on what our rights are, that we have shirked our responsibility, right? Well, that's what children being born out of wedlock. That's why deadbeat dads, or born to single mothers, or whatever it is. We shirk our responsibility, and it's all out of pride. Well, I don't have to do that. Like, I can, whatever it is. But yeah,
It's pride so deep that I can even demand you call me by certain pronouns, because now I'm taking your innate right to free speech. How selfish does that have to be internally?
knowing that you only go by sir, I would do it absolutely.
I finally got that right around here.
So, and then when we keep going here, lust being sins of the flesh. We're familiar with that, just like we were talking about, the pronouns and all the other nonsense we got going on these days.
Which which mystic is it that says that's why most people, is it Catherine of Siena? Most people go to hell for sins of the flesh?
It wouldn't surprise me. Or it's Fatima.
Yeah, Our Lady of
Came out of
Fatima.
Fatima.
Was it
Huge
Fatima?
piece.
Okay. I couldn't, yeah. It's one of the visions of hell where our mother is telling the mystic, most people go to hell for this sin. And it is the one, go back to spiritual combat, it is the only sin. Pete, if you want to finish it off, so I don't mess it up.
So there's a bunch of chapters in spiritual combat that actually break down exactly how you're supposed to walk into each challenging situation that you face that will actually threaten you and inciting you to go and violate the laws of God with the 7 deadly sins.
Near occasions.
Everything except for one tells you have to bear it. You grit your teeth and you hang in there and you just keep fighting through it. There's one that you have to run away. Lust. Lust is so overpowering, as everybody knows. Like, everyone knows it's intoxicating. We talk about it.
We are physical beings.
Yeah, and the problem is that it has such an overpowering set of feelings associated with it,
Diabolic
physical and emotional, let alone the fact that you have other external influences trying to push it.
Takes two to tango, yes.
All of that. So the end state is that lust, you can't overpower it. Don't try to rationalize it. Don't try to go in there and think, no, I got this, man. I can go hang out with this person who I'm attracted to.
Go to the strip club and talk to and
nothing's
convert
gonna go
people.
wrong.
Yeah, no.
It's not. So
remove yourself.
Yeah, so that one's rough because it's the only one that you're actually supposed to run away from. All the rest you go in. And then with finishing it out here, you got malice and anger. So that's whenever you're wanting to hurt people or just intolerance, that type of thing. And I don't mean intolerance of orthodox beliefs here. Sorry, modernists. I mean anger in terms of unjust feelings against other people that really are reflecting on our impatience and our desire to be in charge. Again, you can't really separate any of these from pride. They're all in there.
Yeah, pride's the root of all of it.
Yeah, gluttony is basically...
First sin committed.
It does. Gluttony, excess in terms of the body, in terms of we eat too much, we do too many things. Envy, wanting what other people have. There's 2 commandments explicitly for that, and the 9th and 10th in the 10 commandments. And then sloth is basically just deciding, I don't want to do anything. This goes back to that whole sins of omission.
Is it sloth or sloth?
You could
both
say
are
either.
acceptable.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Yep.
Sid the sloth.
Yep, there you go. And so then these capital sins, moving on to question 75, why are they called capital sins? So the 7 deadly sins, why are they capital? They're called capital sins not because they in themselves are the greatest sins, but because they are the chief reasons why men commit sin. So when we look at every single sin that could possibly ever be committed on the face of this earth, front to back, everyone, they all root back to these 7, no matter what. And again, like I just said, not only do they root back to these 7, they have to be rooted in pride, and then they're combined together to end up with another ill effect.
Yeah, and there's no one of the 7 deadly that's worse than the other. We did say that a lot of it is rooted in pride. And when I said earlier, by the way, I just want to clarify, when I said that pride is the first sin committed, I'm not talking about the first sin by humans committed, but it is the sin which causes Satan and the third of the angels to fall.
I will not serve.
Exactly. So that's what I meant by that. But, I think everybody's got their own one of those sins, or maybe multiple that they do. But, a lot of it, too, I always look at, I think one that's overlooked on the tail end there, sloth, is I look at it as, instead of being proactive, right? My mother always says be proactive, not reactive. I had heard that my entire life growing up. But instead of being proactive, doing your prayer, doing your penance, stepping outside yourself to partake in the sacraments, to help others, doing all these things that are keeping you, like we talked about earlier, keeping your body, your mind, and your soul occupied with good, and I do mean good, godly things. You're sitting back and letting your defenses, fall apart.
Back to the idle hands, the
Exactly.
old saying.
Yeah. And then what creeps in on the back end to fill your time, other than whether it's gluttony, lust, or whatever it is. And so I think I'm not arguing that sloth by any means is they're all equally terrible, but I think that that's one in our modern day world with how sedentary we've become. I think it's
Yeah, I'll put a link to another book in there. That's the Noonday Devil, and looking at acedia, which actually covers that exact problem, which written by an abbot, where they see it in religious communities,
you told me about that. Yep.
as well as seeing it among a bunch of people whom I know. And now, unfortunately, it's manifested a lot by people, usually guys, sometimes girls, but video games.
Yep.
And all the other kinds of crap, or watching sports. Like in the end, it's like none of that's doing anything for you.
thing,
If you live your life and that's all you do, sorry, I don't see how that's glorifying God. I don't see that's how it's not helping relationships. And so there are all sorts of like just outlets that people are just being consumed by.
Not that something's wrong with right recreation.
Correct. Yeah.
So
correct.
there's a
Video games are
balance
fine.
to this.
Sports are fine.
But you just need to, I think, to sum up the book in a very short way, it's you need to define some sort of rigidity in your day, your life. Have a rule of sorts, and so you know what you should be doing, when you should be doing it, so that you do find the times to connect with God throughout your day, to render justice to Him in worship. And then there is time for right recreation where we can sit around and throw back a couple beers and watch a game, or go play the Xbox, or I don't know, what's the big game right now online? I don't even know. I'm
Probably
so far.
Call of Duty. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't even know.
Yeah.
I'm not a gamer.
Yeah, I'm out
I
of
used
touch,
to be, but I'm out of touch.
But just do everything in a moderated and temperate way, and that's really the way to fight sloth, in my opinion. Lust we run, because you may last longer than others, but everyone goes down. Everyone's a casualty of that war. But this one you can fight by boxing it out. So you stay towards whatever your vocation is. I think on the book they say stay in your cell. Don't leave your cell.
Discipline, meekness.
Discipline. Stay with it, and then whatever your plan you have, stick with it at all costs. And of course, with kids, no plan survives first contact. So you're going to be playing it by ear and calling audibles all day, but just stick with it.
Yeah, it's one of those things like in modern day world, right? You're waking up, you're driving, right? We're not having to walk, we're not having to walk uphill both ways in the snow. You're driving there. Even if it's really cold out, and even if you have to park a little bit of ways, eventually you're going to be in a heated building, for most people anyways. You're going to sit at a desk.
You're going to have food. You're going
You're
to have drink.
food. You're going to have drink. Nothing's very challenging. And then you're going to go home, and then you're going to turn on TV, or you're going to sit down and play video games, or you're going to surf Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat stories, YouTube videos, whatever it is. And then you're going to go to sleep and do it again. And it's something, it's just not good for the soul. And we were talking about this today, actually, Pete, about the whole idea of working out. Now, working out, where they got the Church of Iron, that's the modernist, heathen way, atheistic way of saying it, secularist. But it's so funny, we've become so sedentary in our society, life has become so easy that we literally pay someone to show up at their property to pick things up, to put things down. But if anybody, and I'm trying to get back to that way, but if anybody knows someone who is an avid workout, whether it's a runner, a CrossFitter, a weightlifter, a swimmer, a cyclist, some of the most happy time, like they look forward to that. They look forward to the physical challenges that come with working out,
the absolute discipline involved,
and the discipline that comes, but they look forward to that just and at the end they just feel like, right, because they got rid of all, whether it's the anger or whatever it was, they just shut their brain down. They put their body through its paces as it was meant to do. I mean, Jesus himself was a blue-collar guy. He's a carpenter, working with his hands all day. And I do think that part of being, when we're coming from a masculine perspective, I do think to be a man, we need to ensure that we are, to some degree, active, that we are fighting sloth so that we can be a better husband, father, brother, son, friend, whatever it is, so that we are essentially exuding those masculine virtues, right?
So let's take that and we'll wrap it up with this last question here, because it's important now. since we've talked a lot about sin for almost an hour now, what are the near occasions of sin? Near occasions of sin are all persons, places, or things that may easily lead us into sin. It is our job as Christians to mind our place and know what our weaknesses are. So we need to be doing good examinations of conscience, good, honest, objective evaluations of our character, and stay out of those places where we're most likely to fall again and offend God if we can avoid it. I think that going back to combat scenarios are the best way. Looking at this whole thing, this is a spiritual war. This is why what Dom Scapoli wrote is very important for the Christian man and the Christian woman, but men can get the combat reference I'm going to make, is that if I have to go out into the field and I am really concerned about victory here, I don't want to lose. Do you know what I'm not going to do if I can help it? Walk into a freaking ambush. Like, my goal is not to get set up. So I got all this time put in, but I went and did my prayers, and I've been going to mass, and I'm doing my sacraments, and I'm taking care to have a disciplined routine that I do every single day. And then what do? I'm like, hey, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go to the bar.
Slam Jaeger bombs with, all the college kids and see where I end up at 3 a.m.
Yeah, or whether
Sounds like
it's
a great plan.
Or it's people with, whom you're attracted to physically, and it just keep adding on all these other problems. And it's like, at some point, God's going to actually, we're going to get in trouble for that if we fall. And the thing is not only if we fall, but in the end, that becomes its own sin to walk into the ambush. Even if somehow, by any stretch of the imagination, you manage to walk away, we'll go in quotes, unscathed, you still took damage by going in there with the pride of sitting there going, no, man, I got this. I can make it out. You don't know that.
All those graces and protections that you earn through prayer, fasting, the sacraments.
Poof.
As soon as you're like, man, I probably shouldn't do this, but I mean, it's not a mortal sin to go play pool at midnight or wherever, the more, like you're talking about mounting venial sins, the more you put yourself in those scenarios, the more we are actively, because God knows our hearts, right? We think we can tempt fate and get away with it. We're casting off those protections, that body armor. We're dropping magazines left and right as we go onto the X to do battle. And yeah, I think it's true. Not in the ambush, but you always improve the defense, right? You never sit there. There's always something else to set up, so that when you're faced with a situation, you usually get angry, right, with a family member, right? They usually lose your temper. You have done all that you can to prepare their attacks against you, maybe not even their attacks, maybe influence attacks, right? And you can withstand that, and then you can go on the offense and help, right? But you always improve the defense. You don't just sit there and go, all right, well, I did my rosary. We're good.
Yeah, I got enough pescos and sandbags. We're good. So.
So I think on that note, then we'll wrap this lesson up. Then, so thank you everybody for listening, and if you enjoyed it, please make sure to subscribe to the YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, SoundCloud. We really enjoy having you. Next week, we're going to start into the incarnation, which is a great topic. This is finally where Jesus Christ hits the scene, hits Earth, in all of his glory. Right. Yep. And then this is where everything starts to rubber meets the road, is what it means to be a Christian. So thank you again for listening. We look forward to seeing you next week. And as always, St. Joseph,
pray for us.